So hello everybody, welcome back to my survival shenanigans, and today we're gonna kick off by constructing a building for a blacksmith. The main purpose for this building was to finally get an auto smelter because I'm kind of getting tired of having to babysit a bunch of furnaces whenever I want to smelt something, so I wanted something, you know, decently sized, something around 10-ish furnaces, so I can just dump a bunch of stuff that I want to smelt into a chest and have it happen automatically over time. Now the vision I had for this building was actually fairly clear to me from the start. I knew I wanted it to sit on top of this hill because I thought it would fill it out very nicely because it's a fairly sizable building footprint wise. It's around 35 by 14 blocks if I remember correctly. Then I also wanted to use a similar block palette to the castle, so it starts with a cobblestone at the bottom and then it transitions through coal into andesite and finally stone at the top. But most importantly, I did not want it to look pretty, which is sometimes a difficult choice to make because, you know, when you build something you want it to be pretty, but I did not want it to look like it would be just another house or a tavern. I wanted it to look like a blacksmith, so kind of worn down and crummy in places. So after doing the footprint and building up the walls a little bit, I moved on to the right side where I built a giant sort of smokestack, furnace, chimney, whatever you want to call it, which is where the high fantasy sort of started because that is way too big to be realistic, but I love the way it looks. Though the first time around I made the mistake of not looking at it from a distance, so it ended up being too thin and tall, and I modified it later. So after initially finishing the chimney, I moved over to the other side and started working on that. Now for this I had a very specific idea in mind and I was hoping I could pull it off, and I think I kind of did. So the idea was to have a somewhat sizable and tall room on the shop floor where we would put some anvils and like armor benches and grindstones and barrels and chests and crafting benches and all that kind of stuff. And on top of that we would have the area where the blacksmith lives. But instead of adding another floor on top of the structure, I thought what I would do is have two rooms come off the side of the main structure that would not share a wall but would instead be connected with a short bridge, so they would be separated, and each structure would have its own roof. So the two rooms would have their own roof and then there would be another roof underneath them, creating like this tiered effect. Now, while I like the way it turned out, it also created a bit of a problem because the only thing separating two very flat walls of stone was just this one roof, and that was it. So I had a lot of trouble trying to figure out ways to decorate it and break up the flatness of it later on. Though that wasn't the only issue when it came to decorating this building at the end, because once again I didn't want it to be pretty, and I also only had a basic shape in mind when I was building it, so I had no idea what I was gonna do for the details and I just had to do them on the fly. Now I didn't have an awful lot of choice when it came to the roof material because I basically couldn't use wood here, which I think would actually fit this much better, but it would be absolute nonsense with this giant roaring furnace on the side. I also couldn't use stone, cobblestone, or even stone bricks because then it would just be a grey blob sitting on top of a grey blob. That would look terrible. I didn't want to use prismarine because I felt that would make it look too pretty, so the options I had were basically nether brick, which was far too defined, red brick, which was far too bright, blackstone, which I'm still considering and I might switch into it if it looks good in creative mode, and then clay bricks, which is what I ended up going with in the end. But I still feel like blackstone might be the way to go, and not polished blackstone, just straight up blackstone. I feel the dark color of the blackstone combined with the rough texture might fit this building really well actually. But anyway, after having to stop the recording because I ran out of bricks, I finally finished all the roofs and I think they turned out great. I took some elements from the castle roofs and I sort of implemented them here, though I didn't want them to be as fancy as the roofs on the castle. This was also after I watched the first replay where I realized that the chimney was far too tall and far too thin, so I went back to it, shaved off a few blocks of the top and then made it much wider. I also added in a bunch of coal and cobblestone to make it look dirty, and then I added some random slabs and stairs to kind of roughen it up a little bit because it was looking a bit flat, and I finished it all off by adding in a bunch of campfires on top of hay bales so the smoke from the campfires goes up much higher, and I finished it all by filling in some magma blocks, blackstone and gilded blackstone. Then I felt it was time to break up the flat walls at the very top, so I went up and I added some windows, and I also decided to pan the camera down here a little bit so that you can see the building from a more realistic point of view because I think it looks far worse from the air. Then I felt it was time to sort of take a break from the building a little bit because at this point I've been working on it for a few hours, so I decided to spruce up the terrain a little bit, and what I did is essentially create like an imaginary line that would cut off the grass from the stone. So I replaced some of the stone with grass, but I mostly just replaced a bunch of grass with stone. Because as I've said earlier, I just wanted this to sit on top of stone. I don't know why, it just felt like this building should be sitting on top of stone. And I ended up doing quite a bit of terraforming, far more than I thought I would when I first started this. And I'm pretty happy with how the surrounding area turned out. It actually looks quite cool and clean because on top of removing the random dirt, I also went through and replaced all the granite and andesite and diorite as well as coal that was in the stone. So the next most logical step, of course, when it came to this very nice and clean area was to dirty it up a little bit. So I went through and added in a bunch of random coarse dirt blocks just to add a little bit of color and to break up the stone a little bit, but not make it messy. Just add a bit of color and a bit of noise. Now after that, I felt like doing a little bit of detailing, so I started off by doing like a little outdoor smithing area right next to the entrance to the building, and I simply just, put down an anvil, a lantern, and some barrels, and later on I put down a cauldron as well. Just to get some shapes and colors into this area, because at this point I was getting a bit worried because the area was looking a wee bit bland, which was entirely my own fault because I made it that way, right? I made it bland and then I was like, oh no, that's too much. But anyway, I also started working on the inside of the blacksmith, putting down a bunch of lanterns so that mobs don't spawn, some anvils, some crafting benches. I did like a tool rack on the wall on the left there, as well as the super smelter at the back, which has 9 furnaces and is fully automatic. It's not the fastest thing in the world, but bloody hell, it's nice to have a fully automatic system where I can just blip a bunch of stuff into a chest and it gets smelted. And after most of the interior was done, I was not done with the ceiling at this point because I forgot to bring over more wood. I was finally ready to start decorating the outside and make it look not pretty, but better. So I started off by actually bringing over some oak leaves and sprinkling a few of them around the building because it was looking really out of place. The entire kingdom that we've built so far is very lush and very green, and this was just completely dead and it didn't look right. So I put a few of those down and then I started to experiment with what I could do. And in the end, I decided to do some what I call weathering. Basically, instead of replacing blocks with other blocks, you use the same block, but you use a stair instead. So you take out a full block and replace it with a stair with the same texture. And this gives you depth and shadow without augmenting the texture and the shape. I find that if you do this well, and you don't have to do it a lot, here I did it like 3 or 4 times per wall, it can completely change the look of something because instead of this flat wall, you suddenly have this sort of old, worn down wall that has cracks and holes in it. It's not going to fit every structure, like for example, I don't want to do it on the castle because I imagine the castle being well maintained by the residents, but here on the blacksmith, which I want it to be worn down, it's perfect. It adds a ton of character and a ton of detail. Now, one thing I kind of felt I had to do was record some footage in first person because I don't think the floating camera from the replay mod really does this building justice. I think it looks much better from first person, and I also turned on shaders because, why not? Now, one thing I kind of like about this building is that the backside of it, with shaders anyway, it's pretty dark. I didn't put any lights in here, and I think it makes sense because, well, it's the backside of the building, there are no windows here, and there is a hill behind it, so why use lights? Also, on the left, you can see that I've placed a bunch of stone buttons all around the building to give it even more detail. Now, I kind of like how the building is sitting so high up on top of the hill, and if you go inside, I'm pretty happy with how the interior turned out as well. Over to the left, we have mostly like a storage room, so it's a bunch of chests and barrels. In the middle, we have like a tool rack and a crafting bench, a stone cutter and an armor bench, and then on the right we have the super smelter, which is operated by 2 levers. The one on the top activates the card that distributes the items that are going to be smelted, and the one at the bottom activates the card that distributes the fuel into the furnaces. And that's kind of it. It's a pretty straightforward blacksmith with all the things you would expect there to be at a blacksmith, though I might move some villagers in there as well. And here we can see a nice shot of the blacksmith with a tavern and the castle in the background, which just looks lovely, I think. Then I decided to pillar way up high into the sky and sort of do some planning to decide where I want houses to be so that I can finally create a path to connect the skeleton house and the blacksmith to the rest of the kingdom via the path. And it actually ended up being very straightforward. The entire area sort of fell into place as soon as I saw it from up above. I was like, okay, so I want at least one house next to the tavern in front of the pond, but then at least one, but more likely 2 houses in the center of the buildings that we have right now. I didn't want to do too much planning too far in advance though, because you never know how an area is going to develop and how it's going to look in like a week or so once you've built a few things. So I don't want to plan stuff out. I want it to be like, okay, so there's supposed to be a house here, but I kind of don't feel like there should be a house here, but the entire area was planned with a house here, so I guess I'll build a house here and then it ends up looking odd. Because, I like to do planning. I think planning is good and, it's better to have at least some idea of what you're gonna be doing. But I feel like if you do too much planning, you're kind of holding your future self back. Plus, even though I like planning, I kind of like to go with the flow and see where it takes me. Because another sort of side effect of planning, for me anyway, is that I tend to plan things out the same way every time. Whereas if I just go with the flow, it usually turns out different. But anyway, for the path design, I went with the same mold, so we just have a mishmash of blocks that's sort of lined with oak leaves, and then I use the same style of lamp that we've been using throughout the entire kingdom. Though, as someone pointed out in the comments, and it's very true, these kinds of paths don't really make an awful lot of sense for a town like this, because in a town like this, the paths or the roads would be far more developed. They wouldn't be just a random mishmash of stuff. The reason I use them is because they add a nice bit of color, they're very pliable, so you can snake them through everywhere, and they also add a nice bit of chaos with their randomness. Now, after the path was done, I wanted to move some villagers over to the blacksmith. However, I didn't want them to become like weaponsmiths and armorsmiths, because while they are cool and you can get some really good enchanted armor and weapons and even tools, I don't really need that because I have a full set of fully enchanted netherite stuff at this point. So I instead decided to put 2 masons in there, which, yes, they don't make an awful lot of sense in there, but at least they're gonna be safe, because if I were to put them in a quarry where they would make more sense, they would get eaten by zombies on the first night. And masons are just great because A, they're essentially super smelters for clay, because you can trade them 10 clay for 1 emerald and then use that emerald to buy 10 bricks. And B, they will also buy some very common stuff like stone, andesite, diorite, and granite, so you can use that to get a bunch of emeralds and then use those emeralds to get a ton of bricks. Which at this point is pretty necessary because the swamp I've been using to gather all my clay has almost no clay left. So I moved 2 of them there, I quickly traded with them to lock their profession, and they should be fine even though they're left in their minecarts because they're very close to their stone cutting station, so there should be no problems trading with them. Now, doing this kind of reminded me that I forgot to do a proper exit for the villagers from the tavern, so if I want to get them out I have to break the outside wall, and that's kinda no bueno, so I decided to do a quick little piston door right here so that we can get the villagers out of the tavern without breaking any blocks, and then we can just use dirt with rails to transport them wherever we want them. And this took me way longer than it should have because of how cramped the area is, and also because I decided that both pistons will be operated with the same lever. I just could not have 1 lever for the bottom piston and 1 lever for the top piston for some reason. And finally, it was time to go on a bit of an adventure because I finally wanted to add some cracked bricks to the foundations of the tavern as well as the skeleton house, but possibly also sprinkle them in here and there into the castle as well as the blacksmith. So off I went over the mountains, through the nearby spruce forest, into the neighboring desert in search of a stronghold. I even found a lovely village of which I didn't know of before, and I robbed it blind on my way back. And once I made it about 1,000 blocks away from the kingdom, the Eye of Ender finally flew backwards, meaning that I just passed over the stronghold. So I threw around a few more Eyes of Ender to get the exact location of the stronghold so I don't have to dig around underground, and started going down. Now, I know you can get cracked stone bricks normally in the game now. You simply smelt a regular stone brick in a furnace and it will become a cracked one, but I still wanted to go to this stronghold because I need a new end portal since the one in the old stronghold is too far away. It's about 7,000 blocks from the base, and demolishing the stronghold, which was my intention here, is just a really fast and easy way to get a ton of regular bricks, cracked bricks, as well as mossy bricks. I also wanted to see if the stronghold would have a library because I'm running out of books and bookshelves. But anyway, after demolishing a decent chunk of the stronghold, I picked up my stuff, I put down a nether portal, and I headed back to introduce the cracked stone bricks into the buildings. Now, the thing about cracked stone bricks is that you can't really tell that they're there unless you overdo it. They don't really stand out, which is why they're so good. They break up the, sameness of the stone brick by adding some noise. Though they are of course a bit more noticeable if you use them in a flat stone wall like we have on the blacksmith. But anyway, that is it for today, so I thank you very much for watching as always guys. I hope you've enjoyed the video and I will see you some other time. Bye bye.